Okay, so say there's this political rival who's basically trying to, like, I don't know, sabotage your every move. Do you, A, fight fire with fire, B, try to win him over with, some kind of charm offensive, or C, ask him for a favor?
Mm,
If you're thinking like most people, C probably sounds a little crazy. Right?
yeah, a little counterintuitive.
But for Benjamin Franklin, this was pure genius.
It really is remarkable. Franklin seemed to just get it, like intuitively, how the things we do can actually change how we see things, how we feel about things. And he understood this way before psychology was even, like, a thing.
So let's rewind the clock a bit.
Well-
1730s Philadelphia.
Okay.
Franklin, he's a young guy at this point, and he's trying to navigate, the world of politics. And it's a little messy,
Yeah. Politics can be like that.
to say the least.
Mm.
And he's got this rival, right? This guy, according to, everything we've read,
Mm.
really had it out for Franklin. Now, we could do a whole deep dive on just the historical drama there, but what's really interesting, what's relevant for us, is how Franklin deals with this whole, tense relationship.
Okay.
He decides, I'm going to write this guy a letter. But not just any letter, right? It's a letter asking for a very specific favor.
And it's not like, hey, can you loan me $5 kind of favor. This was strategic.
Very much so.
He asks to borrow a book, but not just any book, a rare book, like a super valuable book.
The kind of book you really don't want to lend out.
Exactly. And Franklin knew this. He knew this rival was an avid book collector, like seriously passionate about his library. So this book, it was like a prized possession.
So what happens? Against all odds, the rival says yes.
He lends him the book. Can you believe that?
It's kind of wild, right?
It is. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. That one act, just lending a book, it completely changed things between them.
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. So this is it. This is the Benjamin Franklin effect in action.
This is it. It's this idea, and it does sound a little strange when you first hear it, that if you do something for someone, especially someone you might not be so fond of at first, it can actually make you like them more.
Okay, so help me understand the why. What's the psychology behind this? Because it really does seem counterintuitive. You do something nice for someone,
Yeah.
and you end up liking them more.
Yeah, it really boils down to this. Our brains really, really crave consistency. Like, they want our actions and our beliefs to be on the same page.
Makes sense. So what happens when they're not? When our actions and beliefs clash?
That's when we experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. And it's not a fun feeling. It's like this mental tug of war happening in your brain.
So bringing it back to Franklin and his rival, by doing that favor, lending the book, the rival's brain is basically saying, wait a minute, I just did something nice for this guy. Maybe he's not so bad after all.
Exactly. His actions created cognitive dissonance, that discomfort, which he then resolved by softening his stance towards Franklin. It's really quite fascinating.
That makes sense. It still feels a little like magic, though, to be honest.
It does, doesn't it?
Are there, like, other theories that back up this whole cognitive dissonance thing?
Absolutely. Another piece of this puzzle is something called self-perception theory. And this theory suggests that we figure out our own attitudes and beliefs in part by watching how we behave.
Okay, so we're like outside observers of ourselves, trying to connect the dots between what we do and what we believe.
Yeah, you could put it that way. We're constantly looking back at our own actions and creating narratives that explain why we did what we did,
Right.
even if those narratives weren't, like, consciously created beforehand.
Interesting. So in Franklin's case, his rival, by giving him this book, might have unconsciously thought, well, I must see something of value in this guy, in his work, to do him this favor. And that little thought then colored his whole opinion of Franklin.
Exactly. And there's this fascinating study that looked at this. They had people do this really simple action, just physically pushing or pulling on a table.
Okay.
At the same time, they were looking at neutral Chinese characters, like symbols that didn't mean anything to them beforehand.
I'm intrigued.
And the people who pushed away from the table, even though it was this really subtle action, ended up rating those characters more negatively than those who pulled the table toward them. Their action, even though it seems totally unrelated, actually shaped how they felt about those random symbols.
That's wild. So even these tiny little actions can influence our attitudes without us even realizing it's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is really just scratching the surface. What's even more intriguing is how this whole drive for consistency, for resolving that cognitive dissonance, plays out in, more complex situations.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Tell me more. Okay, so our brains are basically like master storytellers when it comes to justifying our own actions. Right?
Yeah, they really are.
Even if it means, like, tweaking our beliefs a little, to fit this story.
Absolutely.
But let's zoom out a bit here. Where else do we see this whole cognitive dissonance thing playing out?
Oh, it's everywhere. Like, seriously, everywhere.
Give me an example.
Okay, so one of the most interesting examples, at least for me, comes from this study done back in the 1950s by Festinger and Carl Smith. You familiar with it?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
So they had all these participants come into the lab, right? And they had them do this incredibly boring task, like mind-numbingly boring.
What kind of task are we talking about here?
Oh, just like turning pegs on a board over and over again.
There's like an hour.
Yeah, for a solid hour.
Oh, man. Sounds riveting.
Right. You can see why they had to pay people to do this.
Yeah, I'd want to be compensated for that kind of torture, too.
Exactly. But here's the thing. This is where it gets really interesting. Afterward, they asked some of the participants to do them a favor. Yeah, they were supposed to tell the next participant that the task was actually enjoyable and fun. Like, they had to straight up lie about it.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah.
A little cognitive dissonance by design.
You got it. Now, here's the real kicker. Some of the participants, they were offered $20 for this little white lie.
Okay.
Which back then was a decent chunk of change.
Yeah, that's not bad.
But other participants, they were only offered a single dollar.
Oh, wow. That's a big difference.
Yeah, huge difference. So afterwards, they're like, hey, everyone, how much did you enjoy that super fun peg turning task?
Okay.
The people who were paid a measly dollar to lie, they rated the task as more enjoyable than the people who got $20.
Wait, seriously? They convinced themselves a mind-numbing task was actually fun because they were paid $1 to lie about it.
That's the power of cognitive dissonance, my friend.
Okay, break it down for me. Why on earth would they do that?
All right, think about it this way.
Yeah.
The group that got $20, they had a good reason for lying, right? They did it for the money. They had external justification for their actions. But the $1 group, not so much.
Right.
So their actions, lying for $1, it totally clashed with their belief that this task was the most boring thing ever.
So to deal with that awful feeling of dissonance,
Their brains went into overdrive to make sense of it all.
they convinced themselves it couldn't have been that bad if they were willing to lie about it for $1.
Exactly.
That's incredible.
Their brains literally rewrote the story to make their actions and beliefs line up.
So we're really good at lying to ourselves, is what I'm hearing.
In a way, yes. Or maybe it's more like our brains are hardwired to protect our sense of self, even if it means bending the truth a little.
It's like this weird self-preservation instinct, but for our egos.
That's a great way to put it.
So, okay, we've got Franklin in his book, and we've got these poor folks stuck turning pegs for an hour. But is there any research that looks at the, Benjamin Franklin effect directly, like in a controlled setting?
Oh, absolutely. In 1969, Jecker and Landy, they designed this really clever experiment to test it out. They had these participants interact with this researcher, right?
Okay.
But the researcher, they were instructed to be a total jerk.
Oh, no.
Like rude, demanding, the whole 9 yards.
Ouch. I can already sense the cognitive dissonance brewing.
Right. So after this not-so-pleasant interaction, some of the participants were asked to do this jerk researcher a favor. They had to return some of the money they'd earned.
Wait, they're being asked to help out the guy who was just awful to them?
Yep.
Oh, man. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess this did wonders for the researchers' approval ratings.
Actually, quite the opposite happened.
No way.
The participants who did the favor, the ones who went against their initial dislike, they ended up liking the researcher more than those who didn't.
Seriously?
Seriously. Even though their actions were technically part of this whole experiment setup, it still influenced how they felt about the guy.
That's amazing. Even when we know it's a manipulation, like in this case, even when we go in with this preconceived idea, it still gets us.
The mind is a powerful thing.
It really is. So it sounds like there's two sides to this whole cognitive dissonance thing, right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
If doing a favor can make us like someone more, what about when we're the ones receiving the kindness? Do those same principles apply?
That's a great question. And you know what? It's something we're going to unpack as we dive into the flip side of the Benjamin Franklin effect.
Ooh, the flip side.
Because just as kindness can create liking, there's also the potential for harm to breed dislike. It's kind of it's a little bit of a dark side to all of this.
So there's like a dark side to all this whole cognitive dissonance thing.
Yeah, in a way, it's like we've been talking about how doing a favor, even a small one, can kind of nudge our feelings in a more positive direction.
Right.
But the flip side is that, well, harming someone, even unintentionally, can actually make us dislike them more.
Whoa, okay. So just to make sure I'm following, if I do something that harms someone, even if I didn't mean to, my brain might try to justify what I did by basically making me see that person in a more negative light.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. We, as humans, we have this really deep need to see ourselves in a positive light.
Right.
So when our actions go against that, when we do something that contradicts our belief that we're, good, decent people, it creates that icky feeling of cognitive dissonance.
And our brains hate that feeling, right?
Hate it.
Yeah.
So one way to deal with that discomfort is to downplay the harm we've caused.
Okay.
Or, and this is the part that gets a little dark, to devalue the person we've harmed. Like, oh, well, they deserved it anyway.
So it's like a defense mechanism almost.
Yeah, like, if I wasn't in the wrong, then they must have done something to deserve it. It's how we protect our own ego,
It makes sense in a weird way, but it's still kind of a disturbing thought. But is there any research that backs this up? That this whole harm breeds dislike thing is actually a thing?
Oh yeah, there's definitely research. One study that comes to mind, done by Schuppler and Compare back in '71, they were looking at how inflicting harm, like actually saying hurtful things to someone, affected people's perceptions.
Okay, how do they study that?
So they had these participants do this learning task, right? And anytime the learner got an answer wrong, they got a little electric shock.
Wait, really? Like a real shock?
No, not a real shock. They just thought it was real. The people getting shocked were in on it, part of the research team.
Okay, so a little bit of armless deception for science.
Exactly. But the participants, they believed they were delivering real shocks. And here's the important part. Some of them were told to, insult the learner while they were doing it,
No.
while the others weren't. So they were creating this situation where some participants were inflicting harm, even if that harm wasn't, actually real.
I bet I can guess what happened.
And you'd be right. The ones who had been told to throw in some insults, they ended up rating the learner as way less likable compared to the group that hadn't insulted them.
Wow. So even in this, artificial setting, the act of being, even a little bit mean, it still colors our perceptions.
It's wild, right? It really shows how powerful our actions are in shaping how we see the world, especially when we have to justify something we've done that doesn't make us feel so great.
So if our actions have this much pull over our beliefs, what does that mean for us, in the real world? How do we actually use this information?
To me, it means we have a lot more control than we think we do. We often think of our attitudes and beliefs as these, fixed things, set in stone.
Right.
But the truth is, they're way more changeable than we realize. And our actions play a huge role in that.
So if we want to, have more positive feelings towards someone, even someone we might have some negative feelings toward right now, we could use this whole Benjamin Franklin effect thing to our advantage.
Exactly. Instead of just trying to change our thoughts and feelings directly, which, let's be honest, can be really hard, we can start with our actions, with what we do.
So sometimes the best way to change our hearts is to change our behavior first.
Sometimes that's all it takes.
That's incredible. It's kind of a hopeful thought, actually, that by extending a hand, even in a small way, we can maybe bridge a gap, change a heart.
It really is. It all comes back to this idea that our inner world and our actions, they're constantly influencing each other. And by understanding that, by paying attention to how our behavior shapes our perceptions, we can start to use this knowledge to, live more compassionate, more fulfilling lives.
That is definitely a good note to end on. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the Benjamin Franklin effect. This is a fascinating phenomenon and one that I think we can all learn from. So as you go about your day, think about this. What's one small act of generosity or kindness you can put into action today? Pay attention and see how that one small action might shift your perspective, maybe even change your relationship in the days to come. You might just surprise yourself.